Kia ora koutou, and welcome to the second webinar in our Adapting Aotearoa webinar series. I apologise for the late start. We had some technical difficulties, but we should be good to go now. So these webinars act as lead-in events to the Adapting Aotearoa symposium, taking place at the Christchurch Town Hall next Monday. The intent is that we all get on the same page with regards to some of the latest research on climate adaptation in our food and fibre sectors. Ko Caitlin Teru tōku ingoa. I'm the Senior Communications Advisor for the Resilience National Science Challenge, and along with our Land and Water National Science Challenge, we are providing support to the symposium and webinar series. Deep South Challenge is the lead organisation for this kaupapa, and I want to give kudos to the Deep South team pulling this all together. I'll settle us in with a karakia, and then I'll go through some practical bits and pieces before handing over to our facilitator, Anita Reford, who will provide some background context and introduce our speakers. Whakataka te hau ki te uru. Whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi a kei ana te atakura, he te o, he huka, he hauhu. Tihei Māori ora. So in last week's webinar, we heard about some of the climate change impacts facing sheep and dairy farmers in particular. Today, we are focused on adaptation. We'll be hearing about farmer perceptions of adaptation, the barriers and enablers, about navigating uncertainty, and we'll hear about a regional case study on land use adaptation. Today's session is being recorded and we'll be sending out both recordings this week. We'll have questions at the end of our presentations that will run through the Q&A function, so please pop in your questions as you think of them. I'll hand over now to Anita Reford, the Professor in the Agribusiness and Economics Research Unit at Lincoln University and one of the research leaders in the Deep South Challenge. Over to you, Anita.
Thanks, Caitlin. Kia ora koutou, ko Anita Reford tōku ingoa. Thank you all for joining us on this webinar today. As Caitlin mentioned, this is the second of two webinars that are designed to showcase some of the research that is currently being undertaken by the three National Science Challenges, Deep South, our Land and Water and Resilience to Nature's Challenges, looking at climate change impacts and adaptation in the primary sector in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So this is designed to give you an understanding of what research is out there, and also so that when we are in the symposium next Monday, for those of you who are able to make it, we are sort of starting from the same perspective, or we've got a shared understanding about what we know about impacts and adaptation in New Zealand. So I'd just like to share one slide with you briefly, which Nick showed in last week's webinar, but just to illustrate how knowledge about climate change impacts and adaptation is kind of in a cycle. And so last week we heard about research that's looking at the impacts of climate change on our natural human systems. So we had research looking at ryegrass, animal diseases and sea level or flooding exposure and the implications of what that means. So now we're moving through this cycle to think about the decisions about adaptation, who influences them, how they're made, and then possibly moving in a little bit into actions. Well, that's where this would ultimately lead up to. So it's kind of continuing this cycle. So we've got three speakers today. We do have to change the order a little bit because of the technical challenges that we were facing. So our first speaker today is Christina Griffin, Dr. Christina Griffin. She's a research fellow in the University of Melbourne, but her research that she's going to be talking about today, she conducted in New Zealand. It was part of a Deep South funded project called Primary Sector Preparedness to Climate Change. So this was the same project that Pierre spoke about last week, but Christina's got quite another piece of research looking at adaptation, talking about her research looking with dairy farmers in the Lower South Island and the Waikato region. So I will just pass over to Christina now.
Thank you, Anita. Tēnā koutou katoa. So today I'm speaking from Australia on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. Today I will discuss how dairy farmers understand and adapt to climate change based on some work that we conducted for the Deep South Science Challenge, looking at adaptation and perceptions of adaptation in the Lower South Island and Waikato region of Aotearoa, New Zealand. As some background to this work, we know that the impacts and implications of climate change will be experienced unequally. The capacity of an individual, community, society, or a farmer depends on many underlying factors such as class, gender, ethnicity, disability, and access to certain resources such as finance or knowledge. We also know that adaptation actions are influenced by place, well-being, and fairness, whether real or perceived. They also depend on the underlying political economy that determines factors such as markets, land use decisions, and regulations. So when we think about vulnerability and adaptation to the impacts of climate change, dairy farmers don't always come to mind as the most vulnerable group, especially given the concerns around methane emissions. However, as I will discuss in this brief presentation today, climate change will be experienced differently among farmers, and this has the potential to instill winners and losers within the dairy industry. So the research was based on a series of qualitative interviews that were undertaken with farmers in Southland and Waikato. We focused on areas that had experienced floods, heavy rainfall or drought events in the past, such as the Mataura River in Southland and the Waihau and Piako River systems in Waikato. The farmers interviewed in Waikato had also dealt with sort of two quite significant periods of drought, followed by a summer which saw a lot of heavy rainfall. So we saw a real contrast in that site. I will now do my best to briefly provide a snapshot of some of the main findings from this fieldwork. The interviews showed that farmers are already experiencing the impacts and implications of climate change on their farming systems. The biggest change noted was that weather conditions are less predictable and that seasons are shifting. Particularly, the summer dries in the Waikato are starting earlier and becoming warmer. Many older respondents spoke about declining frost days that they've noticed, the intrusion of kikuyu grass in Waikato, and in Southland, farmers spoke about no longer being able to walk across that duck pond that used to freeze once a year. Yet many of the informants noted that floods have always been a part of the farming landscape in both locations. And some, but not all, farmers said that they could remember larger floods from their childhood or youth. However, the floods in Waikato earlier this year were particularly bad, and whether or not they were the worst on record, one farmer explained that normally Dad's always seen a bigger and better one. But he said, yeah, that's the biggest flood I've seen since I bought the farm in 1984. However, these observations and perceptions of current change vary from the way farmers perceive future change. For example, despite the fact that many, yet not all farmers have noticed incremental changes to the climate, when I asked them about the usefulness of long-term projections, I heard statements such as the following. I'm a bit sceptical about some of the information I get about the future climate. I probably subscribe to the belief that it's a cyclical thing. Other people explained that they'd like shorter averages, maybe 3 to 5 years would be a more beneficial way to present information, as projections beyond that feel like crystal ball gazing. Another common view was that farmers felt they can't get tomorrow's weather right, so how could we possibly put our trust into long-term climate projections? Another key finding that came out of the interviews relates to the mental health and wellbeing implications of farming during climatic extremes. For example, one farmer who lost 90% of his farm to a flood in January this year said, I'm always here. I've had one weekend off in the last 12 months. I desperately need a break away. especially with how the seasons have been the last couple of months. Other farmers spoke about the difficulties of dealing with dry periods and the challenges of watching their cows and land suffer. As this farmer explained, our mental health was really bad, all that sort of stuff. I was hiding, meaning I did all the jobs that I needed to do, but there was no checking on how my cows were going. I was doing nothing because I didn't want to see it. The interviews also revealed ample evidence of incremental adaptations that farmers are already making to their farming systems in response to a changing climate. These include things such as bringing calving dates forward, constructing winter barns to help with pugging during the winter, installing sprinklers to help cool cows down, changing the herd varieties and grass varieties so that they're more drought resilient and can respond to heat better, tree plantings on farm. However, we also found that farmers are less likely to invest in longer term and really larger scale investments without clear evidence of what the future actually holds. So rather they take a wait and see approach instead. Some also noted that maybe they are actually already taking steps towards adaptation. However, it's not made in response to climate change alone, but these actions also form part of broader efforts to make farms more environmentally sustainable and efficient. So, for example, one farmer discussed, are we doing it subconsciously, like investing in that standoff pad with a roof so we've got protection from the wetter winters and hotter summers? So are we already doing this already? However, despite these active adaptations, the research does point to some adaptation challenges that farmers are currently dealing with. For example, the vast majority of farms that we interviewed rely on palm kernel expeller to get them through extreme weather events. For less intensive, smaller farms, this might only be for a short period to deal with an intense drought or flood. However, larger farms have sometimes incorporated it more permanently into their systems. The other concern, particularly in Southland, relates to the construction of wintering barns. In Southland, these structures help overcome soil damage during the winter months and during heavy rainfall, and this will become really important with climate change if these events are to increase in intensity. However, many of the informants noted that the cost was prohibitive for smaller scale farmers and that it also pushed farms down a more intensive pathway. So this raises questions of fairness. Can new farmers afford these structures? Do they then encourage a higher stocking rate and more intense systems dependent on external feed and year-round milking? And how can we make sure that adaptation doesn't exclude smaller scale farmers, especially those who are already making positive environmental changes on their farm? Another issue that farmers in Waikato were dealing with relates to the quick change between the previous drought seasons and the floods that they experienced earlier this year. After having a series of particularly dry summers, some farmers thought that they would plant a summer crop this year to help them through. However, this wasn't needed and was a waste due to the floods and heavy rainfall, as this farmer explained. So we planted mostly turnips and kale, and because of the rain, we ended up looking like a winter grazing block during February and March. It was just horrific. Another farmer explained how the floods early this year have sent him back financially, meaning that he can no longer invest in more shade to combat animal heat stress as he had previously planned to do. So those plans have been pushed back. He explained it's getting hotter. I definitely don't have enough trees on farm. We were going to plant, but that's going to take more time now. I had intentions of putting a barn up here for a wintering standoff pad. But yeah, they can't do that now because of the way the season had gone with the heavy rainfall. Adaptation also depends on age, gender participation on farm, farm structure, ownership arrangements, and position on the dairy ladder. So, for example, we found that flood-prone land is often cheaper to lease and buy, and this draws in newer farmers with fewer financial resources to then manage the floods when they do occur. Share milkers and managers also carry out much of the hard labour after a flood event. And we also found that husband-wife teams or farms where there's some sort of equal gender participation on farm means that it's more likely to be involved in activities such as riparian plantings, regenerative farming, and these activities can also help with adaptation. Younger farmers are also often more likely to be open to change, yet while they may be open to it, they often have fewer resources to adapt, especially if they're lower down on the dairy ladder. Farm ownership structure also shapes adaptation and the willingness or ability of a farm to trial new land uses or new approaches, and to respond to and bounce back following extreme events. For example, some of the intergenerational farms we spoke with explained that they were both financially capable and willing to invest in the farm in the long term, even if they don't see the investments in their own lifetimes. This farmer explained, "So it's about paying it forward, and I think that's something that's been instilled through the intergenerational farming thing. As a farming family, we're probably happy to accept a slightly lesser return as long as we're getting by." So it's a real long-term perspective. And we also found that Māori farms owned through a trust or managed by iwi were also more open to experimenting with alternate land uses. One Māori farmer noted, "Our strategy is always that if it's got anything to do with food, we'll give it a go. So it doesn't necessarily have to be dairying. The important thing is that the land is being used in an environmental and sustainable manner." So this collective ownership structure suggests that these farms have more flexibility and an openness to try new things. So to conclude, our research with farmers in Southland and the Waikato showed that the impacts of climate change are unequally distributed and that the ability to adapt depends on age, gender participation, levels of debt, and whether the farm is a family farm or part of an iwi trust, as well as a farm's position on the dairy ladder. This research highlights how adaptation planning needs to consider the local context and the way that impacts will differ significantly across different farming groups and identities. Thanks, Anita.
Thanks so much, Christina. That's really fascinating research. I should have said to people that we'll have all the questions at the end, so you can put your questions into the chat now, and if you can indicate who it's for as well, that would be helpful. So now we're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Richard Fitzgerald. So Richard's currently the General Manager of Enviro Collective Limited, supporting the adoption of advanced mitigation practices on farm. But Richard's going to talk about supporting land use adaptation for a climate changed future. And I'll just mention that this research was funded by Our Land and Water through their Rural Professionals Fund, which is for grassroots research led by rural professionals. So the aim is to fund the rapid testing of innovative ideas. The funding was just up to 75k and had to be completed within 9 months. So it's a slightly different sort of type of fund than some of the other research that you're going to hear about or you have heard about. So Richard, I'll pass over to you. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Are you seeing the full slide there?
Yes.
Or just... Okay, excellent. Well, thank you. Apologies to everybody. My technical system didn't quite deliver on what I wanted, but it's great to be here this morning. So we did a piece of work that looked at what the barriers and constraints could be for farmers to adapt innovation and new ideas in response to climate change. And so, so our approach was to do a desktop review with the agribusiness group, who looked at the information and the research that's kind of in the marketplace for farmers, but we wanted them to look at it through the eyes of a farmer rather than through an industry lens. And then we took that research and without revealing it to the farmers themselves, we ran a number of focus groups and just listened to what farmers had to say about climate change and the research and the information that's available to them and why or why not they'd actually consider changing their practices. And so we based this all in Mid-Canterbury and we based it across different sectors. So we were quite conscious of having a representational perspective across the whole farming sector rather than a particular industry type or a particular age group. And so it was quite a diverse range of people involved. And really the overarching theme that came through to us is that, okay, there's a lot of data, a lot of information out there, but so what? So how do they respond to that information and that data? And I'll just unpack some of the themes that come up in response to that. But really that's the kind of the anchor sentiment that came through is, we've got all this information, we see these numbers, but what do I do about it? And so in terms of their response to this information, we come up with about 18 recommendations, and I've got the high-level ones here on the slide. There's 8 of them there, and I'll just unpack 6 of them just for the purposes of time. But if people want to find out more, then by all means go on the Allan Water website and pull down the report and have a read of that. So what we found is that farmers, first and foremost, were quite vocal about what they see as a view that farmers are considered to be sluggards and low propensity to change. And they were quite vocal and outspoken about that, and adamant that in fact their whole business, and in fact agriculture itself, is based on the need to innovate and adapt, and a continuous improvement approach is actually essential in all farm businesses. And so they challenged that sentiment that actually there was no adaptation going on. And in fact, just like we heard with Christina before, they adapt and change, but it's not necessarily exclusively about one part of their business. So the climate change responses that you'd see on farming may well actually look more like an economic response or an animal welfare response, but actually they're weighing up all these different tensions and drivers, and some of them will be climate change effects, but others won't be. And so they were saying quite clearly that actually we do adapt. We just need the right reasons to adapt, and particularly in climate change itself, climate change issues. So one of the other strong themes that came through was actually the language that's used around climate change. And the term climate change, according to the farmers, is quite political and has a whole lot of baggage associated with it. And they generally presented the view that talking about climate change was about talking about politics and government policy and tax and so on. But actually, when you flipped the language around and talked about a changing climate, that's something they related to on a day-to-day basis. And they all maintained that they've actually been dealing with a changing climate all their farming lives. And every aspect, almost of every decision they make on farm, is in response to what the climate is looking like, what their own individual estimates in the near term, but also over the long term. So using the language "a changing climate" to the farmer group, certainly we work with, was actually quite a significantly different thing than talking about climate change itself. And I thought that was quite interesting, quite an interesting point that perhaps isn't obvious to the rest of us who aren't farmers. The other point that they made was that a lot of the research and scientific information is translated and presented in a way isn't necessarily a farmer friendly or farmer sort of familiar way, and there's a lot of terminology and quite specific data that's presented, but it's not necessarily in a form that farmers relate to readily. And so their ability to interpret and make the so what from that information and research is somewhat limited. And it's not about whether farmers are clever people or not, but it's actually just about the language that farmers work with is different from the language that we generally present climate change information about. And to give you an example, so I've got the chart there that is a summary from our desktop review, and you can see some of the numbers and scales and variation are presented. And this is the summary of the work that's in existence, not necessarily a direct cut and paste from that, the way the data is presented. But interestingly, the farmers said that they would have 1 day varies from one to the next, 1 month would vary from one to the next, 1 year would vary from one to the next. So when you're talking about an increase in average of say 2.5 degrees, farmers were saying, well, actually we deal with that on an annual basis or a monthly basis. So what's the significance of that to my system, given that we actually, like for example, last year was a very, very wet year and it was quite cold. And so if you're talking about a long-term increase in temperature, the fineness of that change is quite small compared to what the farmers deal with on a regular basis. And so they also cited examples of the Great Snow of '92 and the wind of '72 and all these sort of historical events that are bigger than what we've experienced now. So I guess the relevance, if you like, of a major climate event is always compared to what they've experienced in the past. And some of these records might go back 100 years. So they're grappling with this whole notion that, okay, if climate is changing, hold on, we've experienced these events previously, so what's the deal here? And so I think Christina used, well, one of their farmers used the words skeptical or cynical, and we saw that as well, you know, basically saying, what's the big deal here? Isn't climate changing all the time? So what are we trying to face up to? What's the problem we're trying to solve? One of the interesting findings I thought came out of the focus groups and the desktop review is actually farmers want more specific information about extreme events. So if you think of an extreme event as something that threatens doing physical harm to the business, like a flood event or a windstorm, or an extreme event causing damage to the cash flow, like a drought or something like that, then they're of particular significance to a farmer and probably have a more front of mind, I guess, particularly in the Hawke's Bay and Waikato with the storms they had. But they're in the front of mind because they're in a more immediate and impactful aspect of climate change. But there were three elements that I thought were highly significant that came through the desktop review that farmers reinforced, is that when we have an extreme event, they want to know about the severity, the frequency, and the length of an extreme event. So if it's, say, a rainstorm, you know, how often will they have a rainstorm of this capacity, of this scale? How long will these events last? And how extreme will it be? What sort of volumes or rainfall intensities are we talking about? Because when they start to have an understanding of those elements, then they can also start to reflect on their farm system and how their farm system can cope with that. So, for example, if it's a flood event that's bigger than we've seen before, then what's their on-farm infrastructure, their drainage, and their bridge vulnerability? Or if it's a drought one, you know, what's their feed reserves? If it's going to last for a long time and it's going to be regular, then they need to think differently about their feed reserves on hand. And so really practical elements related to the scale and the frequency of an extreme event was actually quite useful from a farmer's perspective. So farmers learn from farmers is the theme that came through, and that's not a new finding by any means. But actually, farmers being able to compare notes and you know, understand their risks and think differently about the system by talking to their neighbours and their colleagues around the place, and also be able to start to develop new ideas and solutions around some of this stuff. So you're talking about going into a new territory with climate change. So you're potentially having to think differently about your farm system. So, you know, pests and diseases, what does that mean for a farm business? Well, by talking to other farmers, they'll know that these people perhaps have been in the trenches with them, is a term that was used. And so being able to have people that can relate the technical elements as well as the kind of the systems impact was quite important. So the farmers were a little critical of the scientific community in terms of how the information is presented, and wanted to get have research done that's applicable, that's something they can take home and use straight away. And so having that information that relates to their farm system that they can apply and adopt or adapt was really, really important to them. And then having an understanding of the life cycle of the business was quite key. And so just to finish off, I'll show you some work, an analysis we did around a dairy shed lifespan. So we looked at the economic life of the dairy sheds based on the building consents in the Ashburton District Council. And there was quite a rush of dairy farms being established in the mid-90s. And so that correlates to quite a spike in the, or a clustering of the age of dairy farms. And you can see, irrespective of what else is going on, farmers are going to be confronting a decision around whether they replace this really key piece of infrastructure, or likewise, we looked at water use consents. And so quite a few consents, which is the darker red, are clustered around the rivers. So with both of these factors, farmers, irrespective of what climate's doing, are going to be faced with a major decision point in quite a distinctly defined period of time. So you've got climate factors that are sitting in behind this, but actually farmers will be faced with an economic decision around some of this farm infrastructure. And if climate change has moved against, say, dairy farming in mid-Canterbury, then that decision, the need to make a decision will also be a catalyst for change as well. So yeah, we come up with a whole range of areas, but as I say, there's so what around the information. What do I do about these numbers and this data? And that's really the thing that's on farmers' minds. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, that's really fascinating research as well. And some good challenges, I think, for the research community there. Thank you. So now we'll just move on to our final speaker today, who's Dr. Nick Craddock-Henry. He's a principal social scientist at GNS Science. So Nick's got research funded by both the Deep South and the Resilience to Nature's Challenges National Science Challenge. And he's going to talk about navigating future uncertainty in the primary sector. So Nick, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Anita. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Kia ora koutou, Nick Craddock-Henry, and thanks very much for having me this afternoon. So thanks both to Richard and Christina for setting up this talk. And as Anita says, I have work in a sort of a number of different areas, and so I thought it would be kind of useful in advance of next week's in-person symposium to kind of reflect on how we actually potentially maybe need to think beyond incremental change and to really grapple with navigating future uncertainty. And so rural communities and industries, of course, 6% of GDP, some 50,000 farms and orchards across the country, managing about 14 million hectares of land. As Richard pointed out, communities face a number of challenges from infrastructure to changing consenting processes, the rapidly evolving political and legislative context, and the particularly around greenhouse gas emissions, but also more broadly around social license to operate, animal welfare, and the like. So rural communities and industries do face significant challenges. Last year, as Richard pointed out, extremes, a record number of weather-related extremes in the year to date, 17 compared to the sort of the long-term average of 1 or 2. So rural communities, as we saw after Cyclone Gabrielle, in addition to the sort of the changing social, economic context, are facing more significant weather-related events. And this will only continue regardless of how the future sort of unfolds. So there is then an urgent need for adaptation and possibly transformation. So Rickards and Howden, this paper came out probably, well, about 10 years ago now, where they kind of looked at, yes, we can adjust practices and technologies in response to current climate variability and extremes. We can incrementally adjust in terms of varieties. We can look to sort of irrigation. We can manage pests and diseases with chemical sprays or other treatments. But as the climate changes, the scale and extent of adaptation to reduce risks and potentially realize opportunities may require deeper, more systemic change. So whether that's changes in production systems or changing markets, selling direct to consumers, or changing the types of products that we produce. But arguably, as the scale and extent of climate change really unfolds, as the potential impacts of changing markets, of other social, structural, and demographic changes really start to impact us, maybe it is actually time to start thinking about much more transformational change. So 50/50 Eora, for example, is looking at different land uses, so new production systems in new areas and trying to align production with land use. As some of you know, peanuts are now being grown in Northland on a trial basis, but that's a new crop in a brand new area. New industries and new products, but also is it time to start thinking about new paradigms? So our current markets are 90% of our food is exported. Is that paradigm one which will continue to be sustainable, or is there a need to actually start to think about domestic food security? How do we balance the need for regional economic development with exports as well? And so simply sort of thinking about and considering changes not only in terms of production systems, but in terms of what we actually value from our land uses may also be something we need to start to consider. So there's sort of three things that I wanted to touch on then as we think about how to navigate future uncertainty. The first, the future is still very uncertain. And so as we've heard in a number of the presentations, both last week and this, there are different scenarios of the future depending on which greenhouse gas emissions trajectory or pathway we follow. And so some of the presentations have talked, for example, about RCP 8.5, so a high emissions scenario leading to continued sort of fossil fuel burning and resulting in much higher and greater extents of changes in temperature, frequency of extremes, and so on. Other scenarios have used a lower emissions pathway in which we try to realize greenhouse gas emissions, try to reduce anticipated temperature changes to 1.5 with some significant overshoot, and that we sort of use those as rough guides to sort of shape then and assess future risk, but also potential adaptation options. But as Christina pointed out, adaptation at a sort of, while these scenarios do provide us with some global understanding of potential changes, as well as then being downscaled to the national level, adaptation is much more at the regional and local scale. It's a function of much more than simply climate change. And so as we heard, it's a function of gender, of ownership patterns, of perceptions of risk, as well as information accessibility and attitudes towards climate change. Furthermore, there's a danger of what Mark Carney refers to as the tragedy of the horizon. Arguably, we aren't going to be the ones that are going to be adapting. It's going to be subsequent generations who are going to really need to be adapting to the ongoing effects of climate change. And so is there a discounting of future risk? So we need to then consider what else might change. In addition to climate, how will markets change? In a high emissions world, competition intra-regionally, nationally might become much more intense as countries look out for themselves. Whereas in order to realize a low emissions world, that would imply much greater coordination and less competition as countries around the world try to collaborate or at least agree on binding emissions cuts. And so how does that world then affect New Zealand and the one in which we need to adapt? So, for example, in some recent work for the Ministry for the Environment, we, in conjunction with MFE, we identified 27 major drivers of future change and then mapped those against different climate change scenarios. And of those, there were 8 drivers which were material. So they had a material impact on MFE's ability to deliver to its objective around resilient land and food systems. And they were highly uncertain. So what will be the impacts of AI? What will be the impact of changing attitudes towards co-governance? These sorts of things need to be sort of part of our conversations around adaptation and widening the scope beyond thinking simply incrementally. So there is a need then to consider multiple futures. Second, there's a need to understand how everything is connected in unexpected ways. So, for example, in the Deep South, we're leading some work in Marlborough with the wine industry, looking at water usage and availability and how that's used in the wine industry. And so you'll see at the bottom, there is this, so we developed a model, working with stakeholders, we developed a model of water usage in the industry. And one of the interesting drivers is that the expansion and the spread of wilding pine in upper catchments in Marlborough, so a pest and biodiversity problem, actually has significant impacts and implications for the wine industry's water use, because the spread of wilding pine is the pine are using up moisture, which is then impacting groundwater levels for producers on the plains. And so understanding the ways in which these things are connected and mapping those linkages further complicates, and as Christina and Richard both alluded to, can complicate that decision-making and planning process. And so the third point then is, how do our processes account for uncertainty and complexity? So arguably, we do have tools and processes such as adaptation pathways for identifying what types of adaptations are possible. And we can map those adaptation options against different futures. So we can stick with current practice, which will take us so far, and then look at different strategies, improving irrigation or changing species, and assess those against those different scenarios of the future. However, if we take those different stresses, so changing ryegrass persistence, for example, and then we start to identify potential adaptation options, each of those adaptation options have different lead times. Each of those adaptation options have different thresholds. Each of those adaptation options themselves have different degrees of effectiveness. And so there is no simple sort of one size fits all. And in fact, we actually need to better account for that uncertainty within our decision-making processes. So what is then the context for adaptation? And as Christina pointed out, increasingly what we sort of need to understand or need to account for is that there are differences in context which we need to be better, have processes which can better account for. So in some cases, adaptation, so some work by Voss et al. Looking at sustainable development, they identified 3 sort of axes. So you can have uncertain knowledge, ambiguity in goals, and process where there's distributions in power. And they were looking at sustainable development, but the same things apply in terms of adaptation. So in some work with plant and food, for example, we're looking at maize in the Canterbury Plains, and it's essentially a computational problem for adaptation. You can map and project with some degree of confidence how maize will perform under different climate scenarios, and there are clear sort of physiological and biophysical thresholds for that crop. So it's adaptation in a high reliability context. Elsewhere, you may have uncertain views around what people want to achieve. So there may be a lack of consensus around the aims and objectives of adaptation. Is adaptation for farmers the same as adaptation for a community or for a household or for iwi? And so adaptation then can also take place in sort of contexts where there's high levels of contestation or differences in power dynamics. Who defines what successful adaptation is and looks like? And so we need to then start thinking again about, or much more clearly about, what adaptation looks like for transformation. And so, for example, in some work with the Aotearoa Circle, looking at different fisheries, we moved away from very discrete pathways to recognize that actually you have multiple stakeholders, some with very different views about what successful adaptation looks like. And there is a need, therefore, to understand whose adaptation and what the power dynamics are at work. And so there are no easy answers. As one person we worked with in the Hawke's Bay said, climate change is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can make growing certain varieties easier, but make others more difficult. And then, as he points out, you have increased summer drought and a backdrop of increasing concern around water allocation. So how do we move forward? So in closing, the message is we can begin now despite uncertainty. But we do need to think about planning for multiple futures. We do need to take a linked up perspective, and we do need to recognize that uncertainty, ambiguity, and power are all part of the adaptation process, and how do we give much more effect to those? And best practice and incremental adaptation are necessary, but what about transformation? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Yeah, very thought-provoking presentation. And I think the 3 talks we've had today really highlight some of the challenges that the sector faces and illustrate that it is a lot more complex than just thinking about single impacts and their technical adaptations on their own. That's important, but it's only really one part of the picture. And so in the symposium next week, that's where we'll try and build on some of these conversations and explore more of it, more of these discussions. I'd just like to re-emphasise that this isn't all the research that's going on in this space. We just wanted to provide you with a snapshot of some of the current projects funded by the National Science Challenges. Of course, there are other funders and other areas or other research in this kind of broad area of adaptation. We are developing a resource sheet that we will provide at the symposium, which will list the other projects that are funded by the 3 National Science Challenges and give you links to find more information about them. And I guess just to emphasise that some of these talks today come from wider projects, and they're just small parts of those wider projects. So it's really just a snapshot, and we really look forward to exploring more of it with you together next week. So please drop your questions into the chat. I see all the Q&A actually. So I see there was a question, Christina, just about the Waikato work, and I could answer that probably for you, as it's still underway and we're still working. I'm involved in that project too, so we're still working on the outputs from that. But Christina, I don't know if you'd like to add anything.
No, that's great, Anita. I've just mentioned, that we're still writing that up and can share it when it's available. Happy to discuss further as well with anyone. Thanks, Anita.
Great. And Nick, there's a question for you from Murray Doak. So you're talking about the institutional arrangements, the hard organisational legislative ones, and softer social cultural ones, especially empowerment balances. And these take time in a democracy, but where is it best to start? Quite a challenging question.
Yeah, I think to Murray's question, I think part of it, first of all, I think we have to start to acknowledge that these differences do exist. And I think that a lot of times we view adaptation largely as a technical process rather than as a sociocultural one. So I do think we need to start to recognize how adaptation actually is. Yeah, as Christina alluded to, I mean, it's informed by and shaped by a number of these things. Secondly, I think there are tools that we can use to start to sort of assess the influence on that decision context. So things like values, that VRK, using values, rules, and knowledge to understand those influences. And yeah, the other thing is probably to start increasingly building that capability and capacity with communities to determine for themselves what successful adaptation looks like. So can communities, iwi, and other stakeholders and partners actually be involved in defining success, defining what future they want as a way of resolving those tensions?
Thanks. I see there's another question in the chat just about the outputs from these projects. And I think probably the best place to start will be this resource sheet at the symposium. But if you're not coming to that, then all of them will be described on each of the National Science Challenges websites. But if you still like further information, get in touch with us or the organisers and we can point you in the right direction. I've just got a question for Richard. I thought your talk was really fascinating, and I guess it reinforces some of the things we're also hearing in our research, that farmers are saying we've always had these events and that variability in those extremes is going to be larger than the gradual changes over time. But, we know as researchers in this area that the extremes are going to come more. The changes in scale, magnitude and frequency are going to be way more than what farmers have experienced in the past. And how do you think we can transmit that message, I guess, so that it doesn't kind of turn them off or make them feel scared, but builds on what they can already do, but highlights that it is going to be different?
Yeah, we had quite a discussion about what's the trigger for change around this, because if you're familiar with a climate event and the variation kind of sits within the events that you've had, then it's actually hard to recognize that something's extraordinarily bigger. And then when it does seem to happen, farmers are saying, well, that's just a one-off kind of thing. And it's the question around how do we characterize the events as we project them to farmers. And I think being able to describe them with those 3 factors, like I said before, about the frequency, the intensity, and the duration, will actually give farmers the ability to put some shape around them in relation to their farm system. So if you know that the type of event is going to become more frequent, and it's going to have a lot more intensity, or it'll be longer in duration, then actually the farmers can start thinking about their own farm business within that context. And I think it's the ability to pull this information down to their own particular business situation is what's actually going to drive the change. And I guess what we all want farmers to do is actually to be proactive about this and not wait for that huge big event or whatever it is to come and the damage is done, but actually front-footed. And I think what we've seen in the East Coast and North Island is probably quite a wake-up call for a lot of farmers around the country, because that's a really quite a significant event for all of us, even if we live a long way away from it.
Mm. Yeah, thanks. Christine, I don't know if you've got any reflections on that, and then we might have to wrap up soon.
Yeah, no, I think it's it's a really important and interesting point, and certainly in the Waikato, this sort of rapid change from the dry periods to the wet periods did really throw a spanner in the works for a lot of farmers. And so while they might have that long-term experience dealing with floods, I think going from a really dry period to a really intense wet period was quite challenging.
Yes.
Yeah.
I see there's just another question come in for you, which is, how do you interpret the gender participation finding of your research?
That's for me. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I guess what we found is that those sort of farms that were involved in sort of things like more plantings on farm, and sort of regenerative practices, and sort of these I guess system 1 or 2 farms that were less intense. I guess it was just sort of a trend that we found, that often both partners were actively involved in the farm, and it was sort of run as a small unit with a lot of social support, and both partners actively engaged and working. And so we just sort of contrasted that to some of the larger scale, like really high intense farms where that isn't the case, and it's run more as a corporate entity. So that's, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I guess just bringing that out is that that's something we want to encourage and see those farms succeed. So it would be a real shame for adaptation projects to really penalise those sort of farmers, because they're doing some really great things.
Yeah, yeah. So there's one more question, and we might have to close it off after this. And I think maybe it's more a reflection, but from Warren Gray. Do we chat to farmers about their capacity for resilience? Farmers can cope with one drought, 2 or more in a row is harder. Climate change means 10 more $10 billion droughts this century, higher chance of 2 in a row. And exactly, that's what we're starting to see, and we know from the research is going to happen. I don't know if you guys have got any quick responses to that.
Yeah, I think that's very true, that we need to start thinking much more, or we need to start thinking about flexibility, adaptability, and the capacity to buffer against shocks. And you can design systems that way. However, they may not realize other outcomes, such as profitability, to the same extent that you might. So what is the trade-off? And I think we need to start considering that, yeah, you can have anything you want, you just can't have it all.
Yeah. Richard, just a quick response from you.
Yeah, well, the resilience question is one we navigated quite a bit, and really the issue that farmers raise as well is it's not just about climate change that they're tackling. That, you know, the environmental regulations brought about a lot of change, and so sometimes those regulations actually are at odds almost with what's best practice from a climate change adaptation response. So it's a really complex question when you start thinking across the whole farm system and the challenges farmers are working with. Climate change is one of a number of things that are vexing them. And so how they respond to that, it's quite difficult, because where do they prioritise their resources and their time? And so simplifying and being really clear around what the opportunities and the risks around climate change will help that equation.
Yeah. Okay, I might just close it off, Christina, if you don't mind. Not responding to that, because I'm conscious of time. Sorry. But I really appreciate all your presentations and the questions and engagement with them, and look forward to seeing you all next Monday. I'll just pass back to Caitlin now.
Thanks, Anita. That was really fascinating, and yeah, thanks to our speakers for sharing their research. I hope you all found it interesting and useful. Yeah, just a further note on the symposium next Monday. I'm told that the event is full, but you can still click on the registration link to be taken to a wait list. I've just popped the web page into the Q&A, so yeah, you can go on a wait list if you're interested and you're not yet registered. There will also be a report summarising the day's discussions, and that will be out early next year. So I'll close us out with a short karakia. Kia whakaria te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia turiki whakataha ai, kia turiki whakataha ai, haumi e, hui e, taia ki e. Thank you and have a great rest of your day. Ka kite.